It was a quiet night when Daniel Harris, a 32-year-old man, stopped by a gas station to fill up. What was supposed to be a normal routine took a deadly turn when he was confronted by a police officer. The officer, Officer Grant, had a problem with Daniel being there, and things quickly escalated. The officer didn't give Daniel a chance to explain himself or walk away. He became aggressive, demanding things that didn't make sense. The argument grew louder, and soon enough, things took a violent turn. Witnesses, like Aisha and John, saw everything from a distance, too scared to step in, but too shocked to look away. They knew something was wrong. Raymond, the gas station attendant, watched nervously from inside, hoping the situation would calm down. But it didn't. What happened next is something that many are still struggling to understand. This wasn't just a case of bad judgment or a misunderstanding. It was a crime. A man was killed that night, and the only one left to explain it all is the officer who caused it. In this story, we'll look at the moments leading up to Daniel's death, the people who were there, and the questions that still linger about what went wrong. What happens when a police officer crosses the line? And what can we do to make sure this never happens again? Daniel Harris was a man who lived a simple life. He was 32 years old, worked at a warehouse, and kept to himself most of the time. He had a small group of friends, but his days were mostly filled with the regular routine of working, running errands, and occasionally hanging out with his family. On the night of April 16th, he was driving home after a long shift. As he neared a gas station on the corner, he realized his gas tank was almost empty. He pulled into the station, thinking it would be a quick stop. There weren't many cars around, and the lights flickered slightly as he parked next to the pump. The gas station had been quiet lately, a little run down, but nothing to worry about. Daniel got out of his car and walked toward the pump, taking out his wallet as he prepared to pay. He didn't see the officer at first. Officer Grant was parked near the entrance to the gas station. He was sitting in his police car, eyes scanning the parking lot. It wasn't uncommon for him to be on patrol in the area, but he was known to have a sharp temper and a quick trigger. He wasn't there to respond to a call, but he'd often stop by just to keep an eye on things. As Daniel filled up his gas, he didn't notice Officer Grant approaching. But when he turned around to head back to his car, he saw the officer standing behind him. The officer was watching him closely, arms crossed. Daniel felt a little uneasy, but didn't think much of it. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Officer Grant's voice was cold, sharp. There was no greeting, just an accusation. Daniel paused, surprised. "Just getting gas," he said, trying to keep things casual. "You don't belong here," Grant said, stepping forward. His tone was even colder now, almost as if Daniel was an intruder. "I don't want to see you around here again. What are you up to?" Daniel's heart began to race. He hadn't experienced anything like this before. The officer was getting too close for comfort. "I'm just filling up," Daniel replied. But Officer Grant didn't seem to care. His eyes were fixed on Daniel, his posture rigid. "I don't like the way you're acting. You think you can just come here and do whatever you want?" Daniel was confused. What was going on? He hadn't said or done anything that would upset the officer. He took a step back, hoping to calm the situation. But instead of backing off, Officer Grant's voice grew louder. "I'm telling you, you don't belong here," he said, his hand reaching for his belt where his taser hung. The situation was rapidly escalating, and Daniel could feel his nerves tightening. He didn't want any trouble. All he wanted was to finish pumping his gas and leave. The officer stepped closer, blocking his path. "You better start explaining yourself. What are you doing here? You think you can just come around and make this place your own?" Daniel felt a growing sense of dread in his stomach. This was not how things were supposed to go. He wasn't doing anything wrong. As the situation continued to escalate, Daniel stood frozen. His heart was pounding in his chest. The officer's hand was still near his taser, and Daniel could feel the threat hanging in the air. Daniel didn't know what to do. He had never been in a situation like this before. The officer's hostility was growing stronger with each passing second. Without warning, Officer Grant reached for his taser and pointed it directly at Daniel. Daniel flinched, his body tensing in fear. He wasn't sure why the officer had become so aggressive, but it was clear now that the situation had spiraled beyond his control. But in that moment, Officer Grant pulled the trigger and the electrical charge shot out, hitting Daniel square in the chest. His legs gave way and he collapsed to the ground, his body twitching uncontrollably. The world around him became a blur of bright lights and noise. It was as if everything was happening too fast for him to process. All he could think about was the shock, the pain, and the fear that had gripped him. Officer Grant didn't give him a chance to recover. He kneeled down beside Daniel, his face stern and unwavering. Daniel couldn't speak, his body still twitching and convulsing. He tried to move, but the pain from the shock kept him rooted to the ground. Then, without warning, Officer Grant placed his knee on Daniel's chest. The pressure was unbearable, and Daniel could barely breathe. The officer's weight pressed down on him, making it even harder to draw in air. His heart raced, panic creeping in as he struggled to breathe. Daniel felt his vision begin to fade. He could no longer focus on the officer's face or the sounds around him. At that moment, Daniel's world went completely black. The sound of his own heartbeat faded away, and the pressure on his chest disappeared. The officer's actions had taken him from a man simply trying to get gas to a victim who would never make it home again. Officer Grant stood up slowly, looking down at Daniel's lifeless body. The weight of what had just happened seemed to hang in the air, but the officer didn't show any signs of hesitation. The gas station remained eerily quiet. Officer Grant looked around briefly before he climbed back into his police car. The night was still and Daniel's body lay motionless on the ground. The officer had done what he had set out to do, and in his mind, it was over. The night was quiet, and the air was thick with tension. As Daniel lay motionless, the reality of what had just happened started to settle in. The officer walked back to his patrol car, the engine starting with a low rumble. As he drove away, the silence returned, leaving only the fading echoes of what had just taken place. At that moment, Daniel's body lay alone in the dark, his heart no longer beating. Meanwhile, the community remained unaware of the dark event that had just unfolded. What was supposed to be a routine stop had ended in a senseless act that would echo through the lives of many, leaving them with nothing but the painful question of why. The following days were filled with confusion and fear. News about Daniel's death began to spread, and soon, questions started to rise. Why did Officer Grant act the way he did? Why had the situation escalated so quickly? Those close to Daniel began to ask the same questions, but the answers were hard to find. The police department offered little explanation, and many in the community felt the investigation was being handled too quietly. Some said that the officer had been too quick to escalate the situation, while others believed Daniel's actions had been misunderstood. But the most troubling part was that no one seemed to want to truly look into what had happened. The officer's actions were brushed aside, and any sign of accountability seemed to fade. Daniel's family and friends continued to push for answers, but each attempt to get clarity only seemed to make things more complicated. Those who had witnessed the incident were hesitant to come forward, unsure of what they might face. Fear of retaliation loomed over the community, making it harder for anyone to speak up. The months that followed Daniel's death were filled with tension and frustration. The community demanded answers, but those in charge seemed determined to protect the officer responsible. The police report was vague, and witnesses felt intimidated, unsure if they could trust the system to bring about any real justice. As more people began to ask questions, the pressure to investigate the officer's actions grew, but progress was slow. The officer, Grant, was placed on paid leave, which felt like an injustice to Daniel's family. They believed he should have been suspended or arrested. People began to protest, gathering outside the police station, demanding accountability for what had happened. It became clear that Daniel's death was just one more tragedy buried beneath a long history of police misconduct.